So welcome everybody. I am just so incredibly happy that you're joining us. This is an interesting webinar series in that it was originally planned as a housing justice summit, a 2-day summit that was going to be right around this time, funded by DSHS, and I see Meta Earlywine, our wonderful contract person is on. Welcome, Meta. She used to be one of us at WSCADV, still is in so many ways. And the Housing Justice Summit was really intended to think about housing justice and the impacts, disproportional impacts of homelessness for everybody, in particular DV survivors, for those who are Black and Brown, African American and Indigenous individuals, and what we can all do together in order to rectify that within our programs. Well, that summit clearly isn't happening, and what we are doing instead is to take some of the themes from that summit and examine the nuts and bolts on a platform of equity of what DV Housing First is. I've called this the Retooling the DV Housing First Toolkit. The idea is to really look at our 10-year history of doing this project. There are many of you joining us who have been with us since the beginning, and others are just brand new to this work, and I'm just so excited to have all of you in this conversation. The idea is that this is a conversation. We're using a meeting platform so that people are able to unmute themselves, are able to participate, and I will certainly be giving opportunities for that to happen throughout, and definitely at the very end of the formal slide presentation, so that there is conversation time. In terms of, again, the theme, I just want to pause for a minute with land recognition, that we are physically in our Puget Sound area on land of the coastal Salish, where I live in Everett. The Tulalip tribe is not too far away, and the different nations that have assembled on that reservation. And of course, in Seattle, where our primary office is right now, is the home of the Duwamish. So just the acknowledgement that many of us with our ancestors are much later occupants of these beautiful lands. So your hosts, I'm Linda Olson, and I've been at the Coalition now for 10 years. Many of you know me, and it's fun working with you and doing this particular project. And I am just so excited. I've worked for the past 7 of those 10 years with Kendra Rich, and she recently left us the end of December, beginning of January. And I am thrilled to introduce to you Jackie Hidalgo Mendez. And Jackie, why don't you say a few words and introduce yourself for everyone here?
Yeah, of course. Well, like Linda said, I'm newly hired on with WSCADV as the housing coordinator. I'm so incredibly honored and excited to join Linda with everything. And yeah, it's nice to see faces and kind of go through even the chat box and kind of relate with names, with areas, and looking forward to future interactions, communications, and of course, coordinating with everyone as well. I am going to be keeping a good eye on the chat box. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask there. Of course, you are able to go ahead and, as Linda said, ask questions verbally if you prefer, but if just whatever the preference is, I'll go ahead and keep an eye on the chat box. Just remember to select everyone. You do have the option to select everyone there, just to see, or to have the option, or so that I can make sure to go ahead and see your question as well.
Right, thank you, Jackie. And later on, we will have a guest presenter and conversation facilitator, Becca Corby, and she'll be introducing herself more in depth when we get farther along the morning. So what are we doing? Sharing how DV Housing First has evolved. And it has been an evolution. It started out 10 years ago as kind of a wild experiment with WSCADV and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where there was the question of, would a housing first approach work for DV survivors? And so we enlisted about 13 pilot agencies to help us with that, to receive an investment from the Gates Foundation, to pilot the project. And there were no protocols so much. There was that open-ended basic, this is for DV survivors, and half of the money you're getting has to be for flexible financial assistance. The other half is for whatever your services package is. And make mistakes, take risks, just show us how it's done. And so there was wonderful freedom at the beginning, evaluated by Dr. Leongai Memblini over the way, and those documents are on our webpage. It turned out quite well, and it has become a promising practice based on her work and the work of those 13 agencies. The investment came back around again for another 5 years of a demonstration and research project. The demonstration part is now wrapping up or has wrapped up, but we had another 8 agencies, 4 in King County and 4 in South Central Washington, who continued with what we saw as the demonstrated principles of DV Housing First. And our encouragement and desire for each one of those 8 agencies to continue with what had come about from the evaluation, as this is our promising on the way to best practice, but yet still learning. We learned a lot in the process. The research component, we have a study that is funded by HHS, the federal government, a longitudinal study that will wrap up the end of 2021 with another year or so just for gathering the data, publishing the data. We've got 5 of those 8 agencies that are research sites. So as we are learning more about it, we're establishing the evidence. All of that is on our webpage. As soon as we have it verified and completed, it is there, and we try to make sure everybody knows it's there. Because a huge issue for the Gates Foundation was to make sure that they could influence other funders. And the way they are influencing other funders is joining us in using all of this evidence to say, this is important to expand on, to fund, to use. So that is a huge part of what we're doing here, sharing how it's evolved. We'll be reviewing the toolkit updates so that you can see it isn't just a stagnant web page. It changes as we learn. Evidence as we get more reports will also be added. And I want also in our learning for each and every one of you who have joined us to participate in conversations. That's why we're using a meeting platform, so that people can talk. I don't necessarily want to do a wait till the end for questions. I really want this to be fluid. While it's a 2-hour block of time, and the plan was first hour is content, second hour is conversation, I want to make sure that the conversation can happen pretty much throughout. So as we continue, this is the first one of 4 webinars. This is the one on what does it take. This afternoon, we will be going into the service package. Next Tuesday morning, we will have flexible financial assistance. And in the afternoon, community engagement. Those 3 pieces are the pillars of DV Housing First. And I just want to add, in case anybody on this webinar isn't signed up for the other three, the one this afternoon in particular will have new content related to traumatic brain injuries so that we can consider that as we work with survivors. So this is our very familiar logo for many of you, our three pillars: survivor-driven trauma-informed mobile advocacy, flexible financial assistance, and community engagement, which is really built on the housing platforms that's in the middle, where people live, where they're housed, where they have their neighbors and friends, what ultimately sustains them in housing. I actually have a note here to take a breath and a pause and see if any of you have thoughts about what does it take to become a DV Housing First agency.
Well, I'll grease those wheels, Linda.
Okay, Becca.
What does it take to become a Housing First agency? Ignorance is bliss. And I think that when you have no clue what that really means, it's very exciting because it forces you to realize that working as a lone wolf does not work very well in human society. And so one of the first things that we did was leadership at our agency sat and talked to our staff and said, what are you hearing from your clients, from our clients? And then the next thing we did was we pulled in clients and said, if we had all kinds of money and I was your fairy godmother, what do you want? And that's where we started, because we weren't used to being able to buy anything.
Thank you.
So this is Dave Dunaway from Safe San Juan. Just kind of weighing in on your first question.
Thank you.
You know, the whole thing about DV Housing First, I realize that there's terminology that means something to some people and not to others. I would say out here that as a program idea, DV Housing First, that's not something that we've ever done. But what it is that we desire is to have a robust housing program because we recognize its value. So our interest is a robust housing program. I don't know if the DV Housing First concept fits that, but I feel like this is a great place to start.
Yeah.
That would be my answer to your question.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that, Dave. And thanks to Beck and Dave for looking at the question and sharing their thoughts. And I, of course, always have a few of my own on what does it take to be a DV Housing First agency. And the three things that I've identified based on feedback include commitment, culture, and community. One of the things particularly that's being highlighted by COVID-19 is, you know, we have historically from early to mid 70s in the domestic violence field built kind of communal living sheltering opportunities for survivors who needed to flee. And the concept behind the communal living was not only to provide that safe, confidential, private space, but also to break isolation and have bonds, connect with other people so that survivors realize that they weren't alone, that they weren't isolated in what they're experiencing. Those communal living homes, and I've worked in several of them, were wonderful, wonderful gifts to many, many survivors. And as we have learned over the years, that when we really think about people and trauma, people in different cultures, people in all of the different places they're coming from, and you add their children and the trauma impacts often on kids. And some of those homes, the way they're structured, simply don't work particularly well anymore. And I don't think they ever did for many, many communities. It really depends on community and the structure of the building. So as we think about always keeping the need for sheltering, the emergency response in mind, but going beyond that to something more stable like housing. When I first joined the agency I worked for in Bellevue, at that time it was Eastside Domestic Violence Program, there were conversations about should the organization become more than a crisis organization. And this was based on the fact that I wanted to build, in addition to emergency shelter, I wanted a transitional housing facility. And the first decision by the board was, no, we are a crisis agency and we should not look at longer term support for survivors. We shouldn't have that second stage support group or the transitional housing facility. And of course, I chafed a little bit at that, and the agency did evolve and change. But so many organizations have had that slow move to, so what's next? What's next after shelter, or what is in place of shelter? And how can we do our work differently? And this has been a commitment to making some cultural changes and responding to the community in a way that can be very challenging and really takes some time and effort. So housing first approach, and Dave, I hope this addresses a little bit of your comment in terms of housing first as being a philosophy. And the whole point behind the philosophy is just saying housing is a right, and housing first, not housing ready. And the reason why these two things are put out there is that for so many housing programs in the past, so many different opinions and thoughts, is that people need to be ready for housing. They need to get their act together. They need to be clean and sober. They need to be out of that domestic violence situation clearly and safe. I remember early funders would say they should be out for a year before housing is considered. And just a lot of barriers that we still in many ways put up for people who are struggling with housing stability and homelessness. And I don't know about you, but I don't know that I will ever be completely put together. I try, I work on it every single day. And I would like to think that as people, as they're impacted by life and trauma, and throw in domestic violence, sexual violence, and the coping mechanisms, that we would stand with our housing homeless brothers and sisters and basically say, people do best when they can have the stability of a place to live, as long as that is what they choose. If they want to have that safe spot, not everybody necessarily does, but I would say probably the vast majority, that our first goal for those is to see what we can identify in terms of measures for housing stability. And that's what housing first means, that we will honor somebody's journey in housing and pick that up first, and not say, you've got to do all of this other stuff. So there shouldn't be barriers for housing access. And if there is an assessment, what we are doing is to identify and eliminate potential barriers as we are working with people in accessing or stabilizing their housing. And this is done with tailored voluntary services. And we know that when people choose when and where and how they are going to address different things going on in their life, for that to be their choice is the best way for it to be successful, when it's their choice and not imposed upon them. And of course, anybody funded in domestic sexual violence world anywhere that OVW FIPSA funds, we are required to do voluntary services. It is not something that we would expect or ask people, demand people that they need to participate in services in order to be sheltered or housed in any way. So the commitment starts with meetings with your team. Becca just mentioned that in terms of some of the process that she went through even before they became one of our first DV Housing First agencies, of really looking at what are we doing? What's the service practice? What's happening here? And discussing it, meetings individually, researching. I believe Becca, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, was probably deeply examining what this Gates Foundation opportunity was and what it would mean. It wasn't just, oh gosh, some money might be available, let's dive in, but it really was. Can this make a difference? Is this something we want to do? How would it impact the agency? What would that look like if we changed the way we focus our immediate attention, that perhaps emergency sheltering isn't the primary and only thing we do, but that we really look at an array of services that could support housing stability so that survivors might have that opportunity in a safe, stable place, or as stable as it is for anybody, to really work on all of the things they've got going in their lives. And how would it improve our responses? And of course, there's that opportunity and thought of evaluation, asking survivors along the way, what is happening? Is this working for you? I don't know if you all have feedback tools from survivors that you serve, if you can do that anonymously, confidentially, if that's what it would take. If you can basically get that sense. I found it when I was in an agency, really a couple of agencies, that having survivors complete exit forms as anonymously as possible when they left shelter really made a huge difference in terms of forming my opinions and the changes that I made along the way. And of course, these were done literally when people were on their way out. We never wanted to inhibit their answers, and the more blunt, the better. And one of the things we heard consistently as I read through those forms was that they loved the advocates. For the most part, you know, there are always folks who have some bad days, but they loved the advocates and the advocacy, and they absolutely hated the structure in terms of expectations on getting along well with other people, when the last thing you might want to do in a day is have a shared dinner with 10 other people. You know, with that whole process of conversation among staff, that agreement of, you know what, we think we've got the evidence. We think we've talked to survivors. We think we've really explored what they're asking for. We've talked among ourselves and are pretty much saying, let's pursue this. Let's include our board, because you've got to have board participation, buy-off, commitment. While it's not necessarily a board function to be deeply involved in the details of a program, this is a structure that really calls for the board understanding and trusting in the organization to do this, and that this is a good response for the community. So that presentation has to be pretty thorough. I remember early ones that I did looking at the costs. Cost comparisons, what might the outcomes be? Was there evidence? What could the challenges be that we can foresee? And why is this change important? How is it going to make a difference for survivors? And so with all of that, I'm assuming by now you would have that board support. So it's a matter of how can staff and board together reach out to stakeholders. Key funders. All of this can certainly entail changing a funding structure. or what the funder is willing to move with you to. So inviting key funders to a meeting, visiting them individually. Maybe it's also a community forum to present feedback and information. You know, it's interesting how communities have really supported us in so many ways. We've done some great educational pieces with our community members, where their donations are going. We talk about how much money it takes to fund a shelter bed night, or how much money it takes for a certain number of crisis line calls, but the idea of expanding that and including what does it take for someone to move beyond the crisis? What does it take for someone to actually re-enter the community and be stably housed? And I remember one delightful community donor, who was really tied to the fact that her service group donated sets of pajamas for everybody in shelter, and was having a hard time figuring out how that could look. And you know, just that gentle, appreciative conversation of, by all means, donating sets of pajamas to people coming into shelter is vital, but they need pajamas when they are in their new homes too. So just broadening that out and talking to community members so that they know what's happening, and can support that. And I know where there are bigger donors, chief donors, it is always helpful to meet with them individually and talk to them about your vision. This is a picture I love because I love to dance. And of course, I can't do any of those amazing leaps and other sorts of things, but I do my best. But it's just a matter of team collaboration. It's a dance. People are different. Team members are different. And being able to collaborate together, hopefully in sync. The leadership needs to support staff throughout this process. And there needs to be cohesive approaches that are mutually respectful. I think it's important to know that we are going to disagree. There's going to be different backgrounds in doing the work, different experiences. There are undoubtedly survivors on staff. And so all of the different perspectives, being able to listen to and build into what your agency is and where you want to go. And finally, the trauma-informed culture of the agency itself is vital. This isn't just the fact that you are working with people impacted by trauma, but the acknowledgement that undoubtedly you have staff members. We all are working alongside of people who have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, homelessness, multiple other traumas that would include historical trauma. And we need to support one another and need to be aware that all of the triggers that we learn about as far as survivors we're working with can happen among ourselves as we do this work. So patience is so important as we think about the culture of the agency. And your community. You've got to know it. You need to be a part of it. Becca, going a little bit back to the mainstream communities, and I was the director of an organization in a mainstream community for a number of years. And many people, most of the advocates, could not afford to live in the area, live in that community. There were also the problems of many different communities within that particular area. And so how do you become a part of and move within all of the different culturally specific populations, the communities that might be, for example, in a larger urban community? Rural communities have it a little bit easier. You know, often everybody knows everybody. That is a part of one of the challenges, but it can also be a beauty. And indigenous communities, again, Everybody usually knows everyone, whether you're on the reservation or whether you're an urban Indian. There, the communities are there. And so no matter what sort of organization you are, what size, who is your community? Um, who are you really reaching out to? And how do you want to reflect the presence of all of those parts of community, as well as providing services to all of the parts of those communities?
And Linda, there is a question
Okay.
from Deanne that says landlords usually do not want tenants who are not, air quotes, housing ready. Where most families are fine and can run with the household with little problems, there are those who are overly destructive. So does anyone have experience breaking down these types of barriers in order to get survivors housed? And that's such a great question.
Mhm. Does anyone want to tackle that before I jump in?
I wouldn't mind throwing my 2 cents worth in. This is Becca.
Okay.
Deanne, money talks. Money talks. And when you have landlords who do not want to rent to anyone other than the white picket fence folks, and all our communities have those, money will talk. And one of the things that we learned very quickly is to always have a little bit of set aside for repairs, so that the minute there is a problem in the home that is caused by the tenant, your client, then with joy and love, you can call the landlord yourself and say, had a situation, but by the way, we use this company to repair it. Hope you're okay with that, guy. And always be in front of the 8 ball, not behind it. And I love your comment. Most families are fine and can run a household with little problems. Where do you live? I would like those.
Bremerton.
I would like those families.
Bremerton. Yeah, I live in Bremerton, and you know, most of our clients are really good at running households. They're
I'm very
quite good at
happy
it.
for it. I'm very happy for you.
Yeah.
Housing first will
But
be
once in a while, we get somebody who is so intensely destructive that it would literally take thousands and thousands of dollars to repair, you know, the stuff that they do. And for some people, they'll learn and they say, oh, I'll never do this again. They don't. But then there are other people who, that is who they are. They're just very destructive.
And
you know,
Deanna, once you have that family who does $3,000 worth of damage, and this is a rental company, perhaps a management company that you negotiated with, and you pay for that repair, I'm telling you, you will have a solid golden relationship for the rest of your career with them. It's worth the thousands of dollars. It's just money.
Got it. Interesting. Okay, thank you.
And I would add to that, not that it needs being added to, but just the whole idea of connecting with and knowing landlords, providing that one-on-one sort of education, although some landlords you might be able to get together in a group. And I'm thinking of the YWCA Kitsap in particular because you all were one of our early pilot DV housing first agencies. And the director at the time had actually scheduled an opportunity to be a speaker at one of the landlord forums, or I guess there's a landlord group that they meet once a month. And they were all very polite and kind of sort of dismissed her. And when he realized this, there was luckily somebody, a friend in the crowd that went to her and said, with this group, you need to reach out to them individually. You need to, instead of appearing at a group lunch, you need to have your face-to-face conversations. So again, I think it depends on the community and relationships and, you know, who do you know? And I certainly would totally echo Becca's comment about money. It is critical when you're reaching out to landlords because you never ever want to burn a bridge. And we know that survivors are human. We know that that life happens, terrible things can happen. and that if they don't have the wherewithal to clean that up, we need to be responsible for that. And of course, support survivors along the way in terms of this is what it takes. If you ever want to get another place to live, let's think about this. So it's that whole follow-up and support from how do you work with those landlords and how do you work with survivors who are struggling with that?
Yeah, it's quite a challenge in this particular area because housing is extremely competitive.
Mm-hmm.
Getting housing is very competitive and it's very expensive. So they can afford, the landlords can afford to pick and choose.
Yeah.
So it's just one more element.
Yeah.
So there also is the Department of Commerce has the landlord mitigation program that will do a lot of that kind of thing. We had Commerce come down and talk in our county, but none of our landlords actually signed up for the program. But there is that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then Hansel has a related question also, and I'm actually excited. I hope that we can get a little bit even deeper on Tuesday's afternoon webinar. But the question was, how are agencies assisting undocumented families who don't have a credit history or even enough documentation? How are agencies working with individual landlords to provide housing?
Mm-hmm. And yeah, we should next Tuesday probably have some concentrated conversation there. But again, what I've been observing is with the by and for organizations, the organizations that are by the community, of the community, where they know everybody, there is that potential within the community itself for there to be landlords who understand, who get it, who are willing, as long as they receive their monthly check for rent, they're willing to be totally fine with having undocumented people that they're renting to. And there's quite a few of those that I'm aware of, and so respect the agencies for how they develop those very thoughtful connections. I know again, and I'm going to flip back to mainstream organizations that don't necessarily have that community knowledge, have that connection with people within the community who are in a way very supportive of those who are surviving in this country, not just as domestic violence survivors, but often because of labor trafficking or looking for other opportunities, new opportunities, the whole range. And I realize that that's a huge challenge. And I would encourage, again, there are often partners within communities to reach out to for help. Maybe it's an actual agency that serves the community in that very intimate part of sort of way, or maybe it is just reaching out to the community, being present with and curious about and supportive of, so that you can develop those connections.
And I'd like to just add on to that a tiny bit, Linda. Linda's exactly right. It's the relationships built with the landlords. But again, I'm going to sound like a mercenary old bat by the time this is done. Money talks. Housing First is a business. Our agencies are businesses. And if you don't run them like a business, you're going to miss the boat on a couple of things. We have not had issues housing undocumented folk over the fact that they were undocumented. That's irrelevant by the time the conversation gets finished, because money talks. Linda's exactly right. The landlords want their rent on time. The utility companies want the utilities paid. The problem is that a lot of our undocumented clientele are so enculturated to not being deserving of housing that they are not presenting in a way that helps build the confidence. That's where our work comes in. Money talks.
Yeah. So I think we've pretty much covered the personally know landlords, housing providers, people who know people. It's a part of being a part of the community. I think this bullet that just came up in terms of your presence may strengthen survivor status in the community. As Becca is saying, money talks, but also the credibility of your organization and of the individual advocates and who you are and how you yourselves reach out to and connect with people. And I want to pause and make sure that everybody knows we're sensitive to confidentiality. And a survivor might not necessarily want you to be identified as the DV provider, which of course is another, that will come a little bit later, but just a whole nother dynamic. But I have heard for a number of organizations in a number of communities that when smaller community members are able to see an advocate from a certain organization walking alongside of a survivor, there is that sense of, oh, they've gotten support, they've gotten help, they're working with this agency. We can rely on the agency and the advocates who work there to be present in this individual's life on their journey as they're seeking that stability and healing. So you're pretty important. Your support can help survivors restore or to build their social network. That is the long-term housing retention plan, that plan that answers the question, we can't have them dependent upon us or public resources forever. It is a matter of social network and who are their neighbors, who is their community, and your support in either helping survivors restore their stature and their own credibility within a small community, or to build their social network in a new community. So this is a point where I'm going to venture, going to another site that I hope you'll be able to see. But we have, as a part of our web page and our toolkit, a self-assessment guide. It was actually created for our Crossing Borders project, but is just as applicable for this one. And then we also have a checklist. And you all should have received this in your email inboxes. And this is kind of that readiness checklist to work through with among yourselves, with your staff, to track progress. So can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
All right, so there is our toolkit. And so in this toolkit, on our web page, there are a variety of different documents, tips, tools, if you will. And over here under the toolkit, you can look at preparing your organization. And right down there is that self-assessment, as well as the checklist that you can use. So please, by all means, use that. All right.
And Linda, this is Becca. I got to tell you, I'm really impressed. You went back and forth twice.
Oh, here I thought this was going to be something flowery about content, but yeah, no, this is my big achievement. So thank you, Becca. I appreciate that. What is it? People stretch themselves. I'm really stretching. So with that, it's all yours, Becca. This is the official introduction.
Thank you. So I have been preaching this thingamajigger for a long time. I came to the nonprofit world from private business. I've never done nonprofit before, and what a shock nonprofit is. Because I've been doing it 17 years with this agency, and I did not really understand how deeply rooted small nonprofits, I'm not talking things like the Red Cross and those kinds of nonprofits, but small, believe that they have to remain poverty stricken. They have to pay horrible wages. There shouldn't be any benefits, and God forbid there's ever retirement for any of their staff. So when I took over, and that didn't make any sense to me, Tracy, who's the deputy director, who is celebrating 32 years here next month. And I decided we were going to just shake the place up. And we were introduced to Housing First concept very early, didn't really receive what would be considered formal Housing First money until 2011. And that was the, as I say over and over again, the happiest money we've ever had. But it is not going to be successful if the culture of your agency keeps bucking the fact that you're running a business. Most social service agencies like ours are run by social workers, and God bless social workers, but many of them are not great business people either. And so one of the first things that I did with staff was, first of all, we talked to each other. What do you think we can use this for? And this is great because the Gates Foundation wants us to just, it was a $250,000 grant, and I called Dove House in Jefferson County, and I called Forks Abuse in Clallam County, and I said, which one of you wants to go in on this with me? I'll split the money with you half and half. And Forks Abuse said yes. So gave them $125,000 over this 3-year period. And, you know, in the big scheme of life, it's not that much money. But the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation said, if you want to spend your entire $250,000 on one client, go for it. Okay. And so we started talking to clients, talking to staff. We had also been doing a baby version of Housing First for years prior with some of our local government initiative funding, because that's just a huge need. Not only do our clients need to identify barriers, but we need to identify barriers. And most of us know that a barrier is flexible funding. I've been annoying to a lot of funders because my argument is, if you trust me enough to give me your money, then trust me enough to spend it the way it should be spent. Then another thing that was identified really early in the game is that there's all kinds of focus on training and retraining advocates on how to use Housing First money. And then they come back from these trainings or these information sessions and they share it with their leaders, and their leaders are poopy old stick in the muds who don't want to do anything new and different because we've never done it that way before. And well, I just encourage advocates to say, well, what we've been doing isn't working, so maybe we should try something else. So I think that more trainings should be done on leadership and to leaders, and listening and really honoring what the staff says. And more training should be done with advocates on how to be more assertive with your leaders. So that said, how do you, if you don't value your staff enough to listen to them, and you don't value your own leaders' opinions, then you're going to have a difficult time selling yourself as a valuable entity to the community. Again, I go back to money talks. If you or your fiscal person or your director or whomever is responsible for this can sit down and look at how much money you bring into your community that is from outside your community, and then you start looking at how that money is spent, you will find that the majority of you bring in a lot of money from outside your community, whether it be state or federal level, whether it be private foundations that are located in another part of the state or another part of the country, whether it be private donors that you have. We had a board member sit on our board for 6 years who lives in Virginia because he loved the work we did. He heard about us because we have a legacy donor who introduced us to him, and he sat on our board. And this is the guy who taught me how to write grants. He's the one who was, I think, 90% responsible for us getting the Bill and Melinda Gates grant. So there are all kinds of creative ways. I go to my city councils and the county commissioners regularly, and I say the same things over and over again. I throw in some new things every now and then. One of them is, I've taken this agency from 400-something thousand a year budget to where are we, Tracy? 1.4 million, something like that, which in my opinion is still a very tiny budget, but in the scheme of private nonprofits in rural communities, that's a pretty substantial budget. And I said, and the majority of that is from out of this area, and yet the majority of that money stays in this area, paying mortgages, buying groceries, going to Walmart, paying people's rents, buying all kinds of lovely things like bikes, and we're taxed and retaxed and taxed and retaxed. How many of you can say that about your own businesses? And it's most people who live here and make a lot of money in our community go somewhere else and spend it for their holidays. So again, the value of your agency should be measured not only in the beautiful work that you do, but in the amount of money. You need to learn to be comfortable with talking about money. The second part of that is, my guess is it took me not very long to figure out that the majority of my staff who was trying to help our clients living off of TANF, so making, you know, anywhere between $400 and $630 a month, trying to help them learn to budget, that most of my staff was either receiving TANF or they were receiving state medical benefits. They certainly weren't making what I would consider living wage salaries. So there was some infrastructure work that really needed to be done. How can we support our victims / clients / survivors if we are still victims of our own poor decisions and victims of our own victimization? It just doesn't work. It's like putting Band-Aids on wet, oily legs. And Linda's exactly right when she says the people who work here are important. We have other people's lives in our hands, and we're not God. We're simply peers to these folk. We're shoulder to shoulder. That's it. And you all know other agencies who are all hoity-toity, who think they're above their clientele, or who are so inept that they should be selling shoes, not working in advocacy. But as long as you start, you know, looking at your own infrastructure, looking to yourself first and each other, and start talking about how are we really assisting our clientele? What are their barriers to housing? Their first barriers is they don't believe that they deserve housing. They don't believe they will ever be able to afford it. Their credit is horribly, ridiculously bad, and it will never be repaired. And the majority of advocates that I've met, that I've trained, that I've worked with, have no clue how to repair credit. And as a survivor who I was what was called a brick. My credit was 850. I could have bought Mars on my American Express card. You know, that was no drama. And one of the things that my husband vowed to do, and he was highly successful at it, was to ruin me financially. And he did. I couldn't buy a toothpick by the time he got done with me unless I had the cash. And on the average, it takes a woman, I don't know how long it takes a man, because there's been no good research done on it, but it takes a woman who is a victim of domestic violence an average of 10 years to recover financially. So when you've got a woman who is now free at last, perhaps living in your emergency housing, which, by the way, I invite you all to stop using the word shelter because it's a horrible, wicked word, but to go into your housing and you start planning and everybody's excited. It's the new shiny thing, somebody we've never met before, and maybe she can get a job. Maybe he has custody of his kids. What a unique thing. And then we're flat on our faces because that is going to be a huge barrier to housing. Even the best relationships with landlords, if they can't pass the credit check, you're going to have a huge problem. Again, I say money talks, but that'll be another conversation. I already hit on the point of the director trusts in and supports each and every staff person. We all know that that's just not true. We wish it was true. We strive for that, but there are responsibilities on both sides. This is a collective responsibility. And I really like the phrase collective because I think that when directors get too big for their britches, or staff are just too meek and untrained to even own britches yet, they're still in shorts, that I think it's really important that you start having those hard conversations with your directors. Make your directors talk about it. And if you're too scared to do that, then get out of that agency and go to another one, or go to the board and complain, do something. I mean, my staff has plenty to complain about. They're just too scared to complain about it, so they don't say anything. I am kidding you. So you start building that trust with each other, even if it's only professional trust. It doesn't matter if you like each other or not. It certainly makes the day easier. But if you don't trust each other to help make these decisions, you will not make good decisions with your Housing First flexible funding. It won't happen because you're going to be too nervous about, they're going to laugh at me, they're going to think I'm stupid, this, that, and the other thing. And you will learn to trust each other by also trusting in the survivors that you're working with. Because, and that's something that for those of you who have been doing this work more than 5 minutes, you know, our survivors don't trust us very well, and they shouldn't. And we have to earn it. We go into their world. We have to learn their language. We have to walk where they go. It's not the other way around. This is not an issue of us controlling them. This is an issue of us empowering them, which means, and I use it a lot with my clients. I do a lot of direct services still, probably 40, 50% of my time is direct services. And I say, if I was your fairy godmother, what do you want? I don't want to hear what you need. I want to hear what you want. And then we go through the wants. And then we start picking out the needs, because usually when people are that desperate and that sad, it includes, I want my children to be happy, I want a place to live, and I want a job. That's pretty much it. Those are not asking too much. As Linda said, and I love this, and I don't say it enough, housing is a right. We live in America. We do not live in a third world country. We live in America. And the antithesis of that is it's also a right to not want to live in a house. So if you've got a client who doesn't want the mainstream house, then figure out what they want. And again, money talks. This kind of funding leverages other funding. Our funding from the Gates Foundation ran out in 2014, and we've never had such a strong DV Housing First program. Now, this is the first year I'm facing a big ouch on the flexible funding. I did not get unmet for, and I'm a little bit jealous of those of you sitting there who did, but I will figure it out. And we did get a lovely couple of options coming our way, one being Coldwell Banker Bain. We're grateful to that foundation. But the funders need to know how you're changing lives. And what I'm hoping to contribute before I fall over dead is, now that I have some time under my belt doing this, is I would like to help other people learn that when you talk money, or when you talk anecdotes, which the social worker in all of you wants to do, balance it with talking what money does. Because then if you're at that Rotary Club, the sweet stories are great for the good, sweet story people. But if you've got a dozen business owners there, they're going to want to see what you're doing with the dollar. And we've been able to prove that a flexible dollar we can turn into $1.50 to $1.90. That speaks volumes when you start talking that kind of business. I think that it is incumbent on us as purveyors of the Housing First philosophy and movement, or whatever it's called, that we educate our clients. How it doesn't compute in my simple head that you assist someone in identifying what will remove barriers to their housing. You assist them getting in, you help them get that place furnished. Maybe you're able to pay the first 2 months rent as well as the deposit, and let them get a jump start on their new world. And yet we haven't offered them the opportunity to understand what a dollar means. And you can take the most affluent family in the country, and you can take the poorest street urchin, and many of those children will share the same ignorance of the value of a dollar. It's kind of like I used to say back when I was a bartender. The only difference between a rich drunk and a poor drunk is how much they paid for that whiskey they were drinking. That's the only difference. And it's the same with our clientele. It's irrelevant whether they come from middle-class America or otherwise. And while you are working through the budgets, and by the way, I would encourage all of you to use the curriculum put out by the Allstate Foundation called the Purple Purse Project. The curriculum, I'm not a curriculum kind of gal, but this one kicks hiney. It is so good. And it was written for DV survivors. And I keep at least 30 copies of that curriculum, and we offer it to all of our emergency housing and bridge housing residents. All of them are given that opportunity. How are you going to make it on $300 a month? Even if your rent's only $25, you seriously are going to be able to make it on $275 a month? You can. If it's done right, you can do it if you budget appropriately. So when you're talking to landlords, again, ignorance is bliss. I come from a very weird background. I worked in movies and television, so you could not be quiet, meek, and shy and survive in that business at all. And so I came to this community, couldn't find a job, and this job picked me. I did not pick it. And after 17 years, I would not have picked it. But I think it's extremely important that when you are talking about, first of all, the morale of your staff is going to go through the roof, because being able to say yes with money behind it is really fun. I mean, it's just fun. We had one of my favorite stories is we had a lady who, sad, like they all are, very sad story. And she got a job. She'd finished her schooling. She found her very own apartment. She was able to scrape the deposit together and came in sobbing one day because she was told that she was going to get fired because she couldn't afford the steel-toed boots. And we had just gotten our Housing First money. It was like, where do they have them? And just go to the store, put the owner on the phone, I'll talk to him. And the owner got on the phone and I said, I'm Becca with Healthy Families. I said, oh yeah, I've heard about you guys. I said, well, we pay our bills. So I can give you a credit card over the phone. I can run a check down. What will you do? And he said, you know what? Just mail it. And she got the shoes. And of course she didn't lose her job. Now I still tear up when I tell that story because seriously, a pair of boots stood between her and the rest of her life. Enjoy this money. This is filled with joy for your staff and joy for your clients. And I'm trying to find a gentle way to say this, but I'm not always good at that. So I'm just going to say it. I am so tired of hearing people say, think outside the box. Why do you even have a box? What is the box doing you any good? Does it keep the rain off your head? No. Can you breathe well in the box? No. Dump the box. This is, you are given the gift of helping and teaching sometimes in a gentle way these downtrodden folk or folks who are so emotionally destroyed that they have a right to spend this money. This is not charity. And if you have people working for you or you are working with people who have the attitude of how charitable they are, please get them fired, because that's not okay. And it is also not healthy for your clientele. And here's another thing. We have a really great checks and balances here. For example, I got a financial request for a very large sum of money for one of our clients. And it was, well, you know, we're getting to the end of the year. That money's starting to run low. Didn't get out meant for, so I'm not going to have a whole lot of flexible funding. And then all of a sudden, 3 entities called me within 1 week telling me, we've got this much money. Would you apply for it, please? We have this much money. Would you apply for it? Got a call from the Medina Foundation saying, do you remember that this is year 2? It's not, this is just beginning year 2. We'd forgotten about that additional $30,000. You know, it's like, wow. So you put it out there, it will happen. But in the event that you don't get a lot of this money, I invite you to try something, a new way of thinking. Serve fewer better. Okay? Because if you're serving 150 people with $10,000, but 3 of them needed to be bailed out for bad debt, that's the only barrier to, and it's $2,500 a piece, you've just spent $7,500 on 3 human beings and you've cleared their boards. Will they all be successful? Maybe not. That's not the onus of, you want to be responsible in how you spend it, but it's not your responsibility to spend it for them. You will support them. Don't forget about them. We still call Housing First clients from the 2011 money just to follow up and say howdy doody. So don't be afraid to serve fewer better. In case I forgot to tell you, money talks. I've written that all over my sheets, money talks. Go ahead.
I was just going to jump in a quick minute related to flexible financial assistance, just to say that next Tuesday morning's webinar conversation will address that. And one of the things that the Gates Foundation and the influence our work has caused is that there are a lot of public funders that now do different variations of financial assistance. I'm thinking in particular of VOCA, where there is, always has been, emergency financial assistance, and they've added housing relocation and transitional housing, which covers a lot of housing sorts of needs. So the flexible financial assistance that Becca is primarily referring to, and that we really want to put out there, is something that each of us need to continue to bring in to supplement the public funding that a lot of us do have access to, so that it's a package in your braiding funding. So we'll talk about that next week. Back to Becca, I just wanted to make sure that all of our funders are really aware that we know many public streams of financial assistance are wonderful and great gifts, but they are not the completely flexible assistance that that Becca and I have been talking about.
Thank you, Linda. And I think that's a really great reminder. And I would also encourage you to educate your funders, particularly your local government initiative funders, city, county, whatever others you have. Now, some of you are not as fortunate as I am, where the cities and the county have just said, we don't give you any money at all. We don't get a single dime from cities or county, not a penny. Now, our county likes to think that they're giving us money with the Hargrove 2163 and 2060 funding. But that's simply pass through. It has nothing to do with how benevolent our county is. And it's good to remind your counties that they should be paying for the services. And so don't be afraid, for those of you who do receive inflexible funding from your government, local government, to tell them, here's what the cool kids are doing, guys. Under goods and services, how would you feel about us, blah, 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 and here's why. And here's an example of what Office of Crime Victims Advocacy is doing. Here's an example of VOCA, what they're doing, and you can explain to them what VOCA is. And here is what has happened this year. And for us, we increased our move, even with the same housing shortage that is around this entire country, from about 42% to well over 70% into permanent housing with flexible funding. And why? Money talks. Money talks. So here's some of what you're going to run up against. And this happened to me directly in the lobby of my office in front of clients. And another was a meeting with a bunch of seroptimists who are normally really lovely people. One of the seroptimists, who I was so excited, I was telling them about Housing First and how much difference this was making and some of the cool stories. And all of us who've done this have got great stories. And this one woman who had, the body language was really intense. She had been looking at me over her shoulder. And I really like this woman too. She's just kind of mean. And she said, making it awfully easy, aren't you? Flushing more money down the toilet. And I just said, I'm not imposing my faith on anyone. I said a small, quick prayer. Oh, thank you. I love these kinds of challenges. And I said to the rest of the table, please talk amongst yourselves. And I turned to her and I said, you brought it up. We're going to face it off right here. And I said, how dare you? How dare you? First of all, I am a good steward of every penny that goes through this agency. So don't you even begin to tell me I'm flushing money down the toilet. Mistakes I've made, flushing I don't do. And we had a good conversation, and her attitude was changed. Not always so willingly, but changed. I want to stress again, when your leaders are stuck in the old school and we've never done it this way before, find ways, and humor is a great way to do it because we're seriously not all that exciting as individual human beings, and we're not all that bright by ourselves, but together we are very empowered and we are powerful. So encourage your leader to run it like a business and take some of the onus of responsibility off of him or her who may think that they are responsible for the entire fate of the world because they are that important. Well, they're not. And last but not least, I would like to close with, and of course this won't be closing because I'm sure I'll think of something else. I would really like you to invite all of you to talk to your clients truthfully. You see, talking to survivors oftentimes turns into kind of mamby-pamby Casper milquetoast stuff, feel-good stuff. And that's nice and it's appropriate at times. We all need to hear gentle words. We all need to be mollycoddled sometimes. But the truth of the matter is they are facing crossroads. And by the time they get to you, they have gone through so many forks in the road, they can't even identify where the fork is anymore. So tell your clients the truth. And that means the truth about what you can and what you can't do. No promises that you can't keep. As a survivor who was homeless with 3 children, I would like to say I appreciated the one advocate I got who was just heavenly. She never told me anything that was slightly off balance. It was always the truth. And sometimes the truth needs to be taken care of a little easier, but I got to tell you, we had something happen in our agency 2 weeks ago that was really awful. And I needed to call a lot of our clients personally. And there was a lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth. And because of this kind of funding, one phone call and money turned 17 of those people around on the spot. On the spot. The trauma lifted. I mean, we're dealing with people who are already traumatized and now they're isolated. So, you know, some of you are probably going loopy. I happen to like isolation because I don't like anybody anyway. But so it works for me. But remember, money is a powerful, powerful thing. And it is how we show people they have value. Back in the old day, they got 3 stones if they were good. If they were mediocre, they got a stone. Now, you pay your advocates $9 an hour, I guarantee you'll get $9 an hour advocates. You pay your advocates living wages and you show your clients that they are valuable. And sometimes it's as if you only have $25, here's $25 towards your groceries. And please don't ever give cash. And I'm done. Any questions or comments?
Well, back in between 2005 and 2011, yeah, 11, I worked for Olympic Community Action Programs in Jefferson County. And we had some flexible funding coming in that we would use just for emergency services. But I mean, usually it went in really small, since we had a budget, we would try to, of course, spread the money, you know, with as many people as possible. But I really like the idea of, you know, funding fewer people, but funding them more, so they're, you know, so that the very, very next month, maybe their emergencies were taken care of last month, but then this month, they're still not on their feet, and that money is, you know, not well spent. Just want to throw that out there.
Well, and Deanne, I want to quickly respond to that. This is where you get a real slippery slope of playing God. And we had to balance each other, and we still do. Because sometimes that client has been such a pain in the hiney to work with. And over the last 9 years, we've given him or her, you know, $3,798, and what the heck, here we are again. And then we just kind of back up and say, wait a minute, today is a new day. This is where he or she has come. The big question I ask my staff is, okay, we can pay that rent for the 3rd month. We'll go ahead and do it. We've done it the last 2, we'll pay it again. Now your work, you should have already started this work, but now you really need to do a deep dive on working on budgeting. Because if this person can't sustain that place anyway, we will run out of money. So it
Right.
is, it's a balance. It's a very scary balance, and it's real easy to get arrogant about it. And I have that issue anyway, so I've got to constantly be checking myself, you know? So, and another quick thing before I forget, this money leverages other money easier than any money you've ever had. For those of you who are responsible for getting your money into your agencies, oh my goodness. The fact that we could even tie the name Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to $250,000, doors were opening. Doors were opening. And now we don't have that money left, but the fact that I've taken that money and I've been able to roll it year after year. How many years later is that? 11 to 14, so 6 years later. And that money didn't, I mean, at $125,000 over 3 years, that's not a lot of money.
Thoughts? Advice from anybody?
I'll just say something, you know, Becca, I appreciate something about you. And you started off with this, which was to really treat the staff well. I think if the staff of the agency feel like they're being treated as if we're being charitable to them, it radiates out in all of what they do. And I think it's important to support our clients, but I think it really does have to start with a well-run agency and a staff that feels well supported. I mean, as you said, I think many of us who choose to work in an agency like this come out of the same backgrounds that our clients have, and it's easy to really dehumanize and devalue the staff themselves. And again, it just then tumbles down to our clients. So anyway, I've appreciated that about you, and thanks for saying it again.
Thanks. Feel free to share your unmet 4 with us. Tracy, Dave's going to send us a check. Thanks, Dave. That was nice.
What are your next steps? What are you taking away from this that either is saying, oh my gosh, there's no way I'm ever going to do this, or okay, please.
Well, I'm really encouraged by hearing these things. And before I got into social work, I was also worked for import-export and international business. So I also have a business background as well. And I really love this idea of, presenting to funders, all these things, and I never thought about how much money that we actually bring in to a community. And I think that's something that I can take away and go to a funder and say, hey, this is how much we bring in. These people who are homeless, they're not homeless anymore. They're parts of the community. I think it's a really good point. So thank you.
I think that's wonderful. And I also, this has worked on a couple of hardcore old boys, business old boys, when I've said, I know social services may not be your gig, but here's what my widget is that I sell. And they can relate to widgets. You know, they can relate to spokes in the bikes or wheels on the cars, or, you know, horns on the whatever. Our
Or a
widget
container
is what we
cut.
have here and in our hearts. So we got a widget too, even though you can't see it.
Heidi, thanks. I see, to be honest, this isn't my first training. And there the chat box disappeared. However, it's hard to map first steps, moving away from simply providing cash, flex funds assistance to asking for significantly more money to provide longer term solutions. Yes, it certainly can be, and it's a process. And maybe that's something that we can check in about offline. And maybe it's something I can think about in terms of working with folks who have done this successfully, as to how do you, instead of just nice little concepts, how do you map those first steps? And how could that work for specific organizations?
Heidi, I appreciate that too, because it makes me very, very happy to hear when other people are looking at the longer term solutions, like how do we really help somebody get that down payment for that mortgage they can afford? You know, even if it's a USDA loan, you got to come up with some money.
So yeah, just in follow-up, WSCADV is able to do technical assistance. And Heidi, again, I'm thinking about what your conversation or request was, and that really is the more specific, how does this work for your organization? And certainly for you and others who might be interested in having your own advocate walk with you in that process, please do let us know.
And Linda, one other thing I forgot, and this is mostly for those who have never had this kind of money before. We learned very, very, very quickly how embarrassed our clients were when we talked very candidly about money, because it was a different conversation. It was a conversation about money that we have that we can give you. And so that changed the tone of the conversation, and it became feeling like charity work. It was being received as charity work. We learned very, very quickly to pick our words very carefully. I preface any conversation about giving money with this. First of all, it's an honor and a privilege to be able to work with you. It's an honor and a privilege for you to trust me this much to talk to me about money, because money's right up there with sex. You just don't talk to strangers about it that much. So right then and there, I would like you to know we stand shoulder to shoulder. I have walked in shoes very similar to yours and been poverty stricken, worried about how I was going to feed my children. And now I can probably change your life today because of the benevolence of somebody else. So where should we put this money? And all of a sudden the question doesn't become, do you need money? It's, I've got it, you need it, I'm going to give it to you. And then we're all going to go away joyful. So just a little forewarning there, because it's very embarrassing for a lot of our clients. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Becca. Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you along the road.